Betrayal becomes most expensive when a man mistakes silence for surrender. The Monday morning light over Manhattan fell cold and silver through the glass walls of Hawthorne Global Holdings, reflecting across the boardroom table, the sealed tablets, and the faces of men who believed their authority was permanent. Expensive coffee steamed in porcelain cups beside encrypted phones, sealed tablets, and nameplates polished so carefully they seemed less like office objects than small declarations of rank. Somewhere near the end of the table, the faint scratch of a gold-plated pen signing attendance forms sounded louder than the city 40 stories below. Grant Hawthorne arrived as if the vote had already obeyed him. His navy suit had been cut in London, his cufflinks carried the quiet weight of old acquisitions, and his expression suggested a man who had already counted the votes before anyone else had taken a seat. Beside him walked Claudia Westbrook, blonde, immaculate, and smiling with the soft arrogance of a woman who believed proximity to a billionaire was the same thing as power. Access was not power. The emergency shareholder meeting had been called under the language of stability, protection, and restructuring, words polished clean enough to hide the blade beneath them. Grant had spent the past month telling directors that Serena Blackwell's shares created uncertainty, that her independent voting position complicated governance, that the company needed a cleaner structure before the next expansion. He never said he wanted to strip his wife of influence. He called it responsible governance. Across the room, Serena Blackwell sat already in place, composed in a deep burgundy dress that caught the morning light without begging for it. Her posture was straight, her hands relaxed, her face calm in a way that made impatient people uncomfortable. She did not look at Claudia, did not rise for Grant, did not offer the wounded performance he had privately expected from a wife being pushed out of her own authority. She only watched. In front of Serena rested a sealed shareholder notice, cream-white paper under a clear protective sleeve, its embossed seal turned slightly toward the board, but its contents still unread. It did not look dramatic. That was why no one feared it yet. Grant took his chair at the head of the table and let the silence settle around him as if the room itself had been designed to obey. On the wall screen behind him, the agenda appeared in narrow corporate type: emergency governance review, equity protection restructuring, voting authority clarification. The words were sterile enough to pass through legal departments without leaving fingerprints. Serena read them once. Grant adjusted his microphone, glanced toward Lydia Fairmont, the company's general counsel, and gave the smallest nod for proceedings to begin. His confidence had the smoothness of habit, the kind formed over decades of people standing when he entered, laughing when he joked, and mistaking his impatience for vision. He believed Serena would be forced to defend herself in front of the board, and that any defense would make her look emotional, personal, inconvenient. He believed every vote had already chosen him. Claudia lowered herself into the advisor's row with a delicate smile, crossing her legs as if she had earned the right to witness a wife being reduced to a footnote. A few directors avoided Serena's eyes. A senior investor stirred his coffee without drinking it. Lydia Fairmont remained still, one hand resting near her legal pad, her expression unreadable behind thin silver frames. The meeting began. Grant spoke first, smoothly, almost generously, about protecting the company from internal conflict and ensuring that no individual shareholder could disrupt the future of Hawthorne Global Holdings. He did not look at Serena when he said individual shareholder. He wanted the insult to travel without his fingerprints on it. Serena did not move. She let him finish every sentence, let him build the case, let him place each polished word on the record where it could not later be denied. The room listened as Grant dressed the removal of her voice in the language of stewardship. Then Lydia's eyes shifted to the sealed notice in front of Serena. For the first time that morning, Grant's smile tightened by a fraction. Grant had learned long ago that a boardroom could feel like private property when enough people depended on his approval to keep their seats. He had built Hawthorne Global Holdings on acquisitions, debt restructurings, hostile bids, and the terrifying charm of a man who could make ruin sound like opportunity. To investors, he was decisive. To bankers, he was useful. To the press, he was the kind of billionaire who appeared inevitable until one studied the signatures behind the empire. Serena had studied the signatures. For 12 years, she had stood beside him at annual reports, foundation launches, acquisition briefings, and carefully photographed executive retreats. always elegant, always measured, always described in captions as his wife before anyone mentioned her degrees, her advisory work, or the private legal architecture she had helped design. Grant preferred it that way because a woman underestimated in public was easier to diminish in private. He called it balance because control would have sounded too honest. At home, he praised her taste and ignored her analysis. In meetings, he thanked her for attending and redirected her questions to men who repeated her exact point 10 minutes later. When she warned him that governance language mattered, he smiled as if clauses were decoration. When she asked why his personal advisors were reviewing shareholder protections without independent counsel present, he told her not to turn marriage into litigation. Serena had not raised her voice then. She had only closed the document and said, "Noted." That was the first warning he missed. Now, in the cold brightness of the shareholder room, Grant spoke with the practiced patience of a man pretending generosity while tightening a noose. He explained that Serena's independent share position had become a source of ambiguity, that the company required centralized voting discipline, and that no marriage, however respected, should be allowed to complicate institutional stability. The words landed softly, but everyone understood what they were designed to do. Claudia understood only the theater. She watched Serena with a delicate, satisfied tilt of her chin, as if waiting for the first crack in that calm face, the first tremor of humiliation, the first sign that the wife had finally realized she was being replaced not just at dinner tables, but in the machinery of power itself. Serena gave her nothing. She sat with her hands folded near the sealed notice, pearl earrings catching a pale line of light, her expression quiet enough to make Grant push harder. "This is not personal," he said, turning at last toward her with the tender cruelty of a man who wanted witnesses to admire his restraint. Serena looked at him. "It is recorded." The silence tightened. Grant's jaw moved once, but he recovered with a small laugh and told the board that emotional interpretations should not derail responsible governance. He had used that phrase before, usually when Serena noticed something he wanted hidden beneath procedure. Emotional interpretation meant she had read the room too accurately. Responsible governance meant he wanted obedience. A director near the windows shifted in his chair, and the sound of porcelain touching porcelain seemed suddenly indecently loud. Grant continued, explaining that the restructuring would preserve Serena's economic interest while consolidating voting authority under experienced executive leadership. He said she would still benefit from the company's growth. He said she would remain valued. He said the word valued the way men say it when they mean silent. Serena's gaze lowered briefly to the agenda, then returned to him. Not ownership. The sentence was barely more than a breath, yet it cut through 3 pages of prepared language. Grant's smile thinned again because she had not accused him, had not pleaded, had not given him anger to manage or pain to dismiss. She had named the issue cleanly, and clean language was dangerous in a room built on euphemism. Lydia Fairmont made a small notation on her legal pad. Across the table, one of the independent directors stopped scrolling through his tablet. The first real shift in the room did not come as shock, but attention. Grant felt it and mistook it for resistance he could dominate. He leaned back, spread one hand beside the microphone, and reminded everyone that leadership required difficult decisions. Serena watched the gesture, the wedding ring flashing as his fingers touched the polished table, the same hand that had signed documents he believed existed only to impress other powerful men. He thought signatures were ceremony. Serena knew they were obligations with dates attached. Claudia uncrossed her legs, less comfortable now, sensing that the silence around Serena was not weakness but gravity. Grant turned to Lydia and asked if there was any legal obstacle to proceeding with the vote. He expected the answer he had paid years of authority to receive. Lydia did not look at him first. She looked at Serena. Serena gave the smallest nod. "Proceed," she said. 3 years earlier, before the company's marble lobby carried Grant's portrait in bronze relief, Hawthorne Global Holdings had needed trust more than admiration. Its debt was manageable but visible, its expansion aggressive but fragile, and the old institutional investors wanted proof that Grant's brilliance would not one day become the company's greatest liability. They did not say it that plainly in the conference room overlooking Park Avenue. Wealth rarely tells the truth until counsel starts marking the documents. Serena had been the only person at that table who understood the fear beneath their politeness. The investors did not fear failure, because failure could be priced, insured, restructured, and sold. They feared unchecked ego inside a voting structure with no independent restraint. Grant heard their questions as compliments in disguise, believing men only doubted him because they had not yet been close enough to his victories. Serena heard the clauses they were asking for without saying their names. She requested a protective voting trust. The room had changed then, not dramatically, but in the subtle way serious rooms change when someone introduces the exact solution everyone was too cautious to demand. A trust lawyer cleared his throat. A pension fund representative leaned forward. Grant smiled as if Serena had brought a decorative suggestion to a structural negotiation. "Explain it simply," he had said, his voice warm enough to sound generous and sharp enough to remind her who he believed owned the table. Serena did not flinch. "It limits abuse." That was all. The lawyers did the rest, because truth, once placed correctly, does not need ornament. The trust would not disturb ordinary ownership, dividends, or economic benefit. It would remain dormant unless a controlling party attempted coercive transfer, bad faith restructuring, undisclosed self-dealing, or manipulation of related party voting power. If triggered, the offending party's voting authority could be suspended, reassigned, or placed under independent administration until the board confirmed compliance. Grant listened for only the parts that sounded impressive: governance safeguard, investor confidence, founder-friendly continuity. He liked phrases that made restraint look like strategy. He asked whether the mechanism would help close the funding round, and when the senior investor said it would help immensely, Grant took the gold-trimmed executive pen offered by counsel and signed with the speed of a man approving his own applause. Serena watched the ink dry. He did not ask why her eyes stayed on the signature page longer than necessary. He only joked that if the world ever needed protection from him, it had already become too boring to deserve him. Several men laughed. Serena did not. Later, in the private elevator descending toward the waiting cars, Grant told her she had done well, as if she were a junior advisor rewarded for not embarrassing him. He said investors liked discipline when it came wrapped in feminine calm. He said it with a kiss near her temple, careless, public, possessive. Serena looked at his reflection in the elevator doors. "You signed it." Grant chuckled. "I sign 100 things a week." That was the problem. 4 years after, the trust remained invisible, buried in governance binders, compliance reviews, and annual confirmations that Grant skimmed while speaking on encrypted calls about acquisitions in Zurich, layoffs in Dallas, and a media partnership he wanted announced before the numbers were ready. Each year, Lydia Fairmont circulated the same compliance certification. Each year, Grant signed. Each year, Serena kept her copy of the structure clean, current, and quietly aligned with every revision in corporate law. She never mentioned it at dinner. She never used it in an argument. She never threatened him with it when he dismissed her concerns, praised her dress instead of her judgment, or brought Claudia's name into conversations where no advisor belonged. Silence became her record. Now, back in the boardroom, that old signature had returned like a debt finally called. Lydia's hand moved from her legal pad to the sealed notice, and the directors watched with the cautious stillness of people beginning to realize the meeting had a second agenda. Grant looked irritated, not afraid. He still believed procedure was decoration. Serena knew it was control. Grant's plan had not begun as a dramatic betrayal. Men like him preferred betrayal to arrive dressed as policy. 6 weeks before the emergency meeting, he had summoned a private governance review under the harmless language of modernization, asking outside counsel to examine shareholder efficiency, voting clarity, and risk exposure from domestic entanglement. No one in the room had asked why a wife's shares were being described like a threat on a balance sheet. That was how the removal began. He did not try to rip Serena's ownership from her hands in one crude motion, because crude things leave fingerprints. Instead, he requested a reclassification proposal that would preserve her dividends while shifting her voting authority into a centralized executive block controlled by him. On paper, she would remain wealthy. In practice, she would become ornamental. Grant trusted that distinction to protect him. He reviewed the draft from his corner office late at night, while the city glittered beneath him like something already purchased, one encrypted phone beside his hand, and a cup of untouched espresso cooling near the glass. The legal language pleased him because it sounded clean, institutional, almost noble. It would let him say he had protected the company while quietly cutting his wife out of the room where protection was defined. He called it stability. Claudia Westbrook learned about the proposal not because she understood governance, but because Grant enjoyed explaining power to beautiful women who admired the performance of it. She sat across from him during a private strategy breakfast at the executive dining floor, wearing cream silk and a diamond bracelet she had not paid for, listening as he described Serena's position as sentimental leverage. Claudia smiled when he said that after the restructuring, board votes would become less complicated. She liked uncomplicated things when borrowed privilege made them hers. Will she fight it? Claudia asked, lifting her coffee with theatrical innocence. Grant smiled. She won't want the embarrassment. That was his second mistake. He believed Serena's dignity was fear of exposure, when it was actually immunity from spectacle. During those same weeks, Serena noticed the small disturbances before anyone told her the truth. A compliance memo routed around her counsel, a meeting invitation removed from her calendar, a draft proxy table with her voting column shaded in gray. She did not storm into Grant's office. She did not accuse his assistants. She asked Lydia Fairmont for the revised governance packet and read it alone in a quiet legal archive room where even the air seemed trained not to interrupt. Page by page, the intention revealed itself. Grant had not merely underestimated her. He had counted on her silence being legally empty. Serena placed one finger on the reclassification clause and stopped. The language Grant wanted to use against her sat directly inside the trigger zone of the protective trust he had signed years earlier. Coercive restructuring of related party voting rights. Bad faith consolidation of control. Undisclosed personal benefit. The trigger was not hidden. It had only been ignored by the man who believed every document existed to serve him. Serena called Lydia once. Prepare it. Lydia did not ask if Serena was certain, because certainty had a sound, and Serena's voice had carried it. From that moment, the countermeasure moved without drama. Notices were drafted, filings reviewed, independent trustees alerted, voting records confirmed, and the sealed shareholder notice prepared under proper procedure. No press leaks. No emotional confrontation. No warning sent to Grant, so he could wrap himself in outrage before the law touched him. Quiet can be merciful. It can also be enforceable. On the morning of the meeting, Grant entered believing the room had been arranged for Serena's reduction. He had placed Claudia in the advisor's row as a living insult, a reminder that his private preferences were now bold enough to sit beside his public power. He wanted Serena to see the future he imagined for her, wealthy, silent, beautifully displaced. But Serena had already seen the future more clearly than he had. She knew the vote he wanted would never become his instrument, because the attempt itself had activated the mechanism that would remove his hand from the instrument entirely. Now, as Lydia's fingers rested on the sealed notice, Grant glanced at Serena with impatience sharpening behind his practiced smile. "We don't need theater," he said. Serena looked at the document, then at him. "Read the clause." The sentence landed with no heat, no accusation, no plea. It gave him no emotion to exploit. Around the table, the directors waited, and for the first time Grant seemed to understand that Serena had not come to defend her shares. She had come to count his authority. Lydia Fairmont rose without hurry, and the movement drew more attention than any raised voice could have commanded. She was 63, silver-haired, precise, and known inside Hawthorne Global Holdings as the only person who could make a billionaire pause with a single-page reference. Her authority did not come from volume. It came from memory. Grant watched her stand with the irritation of a man whose rhythm had been interrupted by someone he usually considered part of the machinery. "Counsel," he said, smoothing one hand over the agenda. "Unless this concerns the vote directly, I suggest we reserve it for later." Lydia looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "It concerns whether you may vote." The sentence did not echo, but the room received it as if it had struck glass. A director near the far end stopped breathing for a moment. Claudia's smile loosened, not collapsing yet, but separating from certainty. Grant gave a short laugh, the kind powerful men use when they want everyone else to remember the rules before the rules remember them. "That is absurd," he said. Lydia did not answer the insult. She lifted the sealed shareholder notice from the table with both hands and placed it beside the central microphone, where everyone could see the embossed mark and the time-stamped compliance label. The paper looked almost modest under the boardroom lights, but the silence around it grew heavier with each second. The record had entered the room. Grant leaned back, attempting to recover command through posture, but his fingers had tightened against the edge of his chair. He glanced at Serena, expecting triumph, anger, perhaps the pleasure of revenge made visible. She gave him nothing. Her expression remained still, her eyes resting on the notice as if it had arrived exactly on schedule. Lydia began with the corporate record, not the accusation. She cited the protective voting trust, the annual certifications, the related party provisions, and the specific clause triggered by any coercive restructuring designed to consolidate control through domestic or fiduciary pressure. Her voice was calm enough to sound almost administrative. That made it harder to dismiss. Grant interrupted before she reached the operative language. "This is a governance review," he said. "Not coercion." Serena turned her gaze to him. "Your draft says otherwise." 5 words. No wound exposed. No explanation offered. Only the fact placed where his denial could not step around it. Lydia slid a tablet toward the independent directors, showing the highlighted section of the proposed restructuring with every sensitive phrase already cross-referenced. Centralized executive voting block. Transfer of practical authority. Preservation of economic benefit without independent voting discretion. The language Grant had admired for its cleanliness now looked surgical in the wrong direction. It was his own language, preserved in the record. Grant's eyes flickered toward Claudia, then away, as if realizing she had no place inside a room where words could cost billions. Claudia lowered her chin and looked at the table, suddenly less eager to be seen near him. The first crack in Grant's world was not public humiliation. It was Claudia realizing his proximity no longer protected her. Lydia continued, explaining that once the triggering attempt had been documented, independent trustees had been notified according to procedure, and temporary suspension of Grant's voting authority had entered effect before the meeting was called to order. A murmur moved through the board, brief and restrained, the sound of people recalculating loyalties without wanting to appear late. Grant sat forward. "I am the founder." Lydia nodded once, almost politely. "You are also a signatory." That landed harder than accusation. The wall screen updated with a soft electronic tone, and the voting table changed before everyone's eyes. Grant Hawthorne's block remained visible in value, but beside the column marked voting authority, the status shifted to suspended pending independent review. His wealth was still there. His command was not. Serena did not smile. She simply adjusted one pearl earring, a small movement so composed it made the entire collapse look less like an attack than a correction. Grant reached for his microphone, but Lydia spoke first. "The board may proceed without counting Mr. Hawthorne's vote." For the first time that morning, the head of the table no longer belonged to the man sitting there. The nameplate still read chairman. The room no longer did. Grant stared at the screen as if numbers, properly intimidated, might rearrange themselves in his favor. The voting table remained unchanged, cold and exact, reducing decades of command to one quiet status line beside his name. Suspended pending independent review. He had survived hostile takeovers, federal inquiries, collapsing markets, and former partners who learned too late that friendship was not protection. Yet none of those moments had stripped him as completely as a gray word on a boardroom display. He was still rich. He just could not decide. The table waited for him to understand the difference between having money and having authority. Grant reached for the microphone, pressed the button, and began speaking before the light fully turned green. "This board will not be hijacked by a procedural ambush," he said, forcing his voice back into its familiar register of controlled outrage. "My wife's personal resentment has clearly been dressed up as corporate governance." Several directors looked down at their tablets, not because they believed him, but because powerful men in decline were embarrassing to watch directly. Lydia Fairmont turned one page. The notice was filed before the meeting. Grant's eyes sharpened. Filed by whom? The room did not move. Serena lifted her gaze. Proper authority. 2 words, and his accusation lost its target. He wanted a fight he could frame as marital bitterness, a scene where her anger would give shape to his defense, but she denied him the luxury of a wound displayed in public. Her calm made him look theatrical. Grant pivoted toward the independent directors, naming two of them as if names were hooks he could still pull. He reminded one of the expansion financing he had secured during the European downturn. He reminded another of the charitable endowment he had protected during the tax review. He spoke like a man calling in old debts at a bank that had already frozen his account. No one answered quickly. That was new. A senior investor who had once laughed too loudly at Grant's jokes removed his glasses, cleaned them with a folded cloth, and asked Lydia whether quorum remained intact without Grant's voting block. Lydia replied that quorum remained intact under the revised calculation and that Serena's voting authority, together with the independent trust allocation, allowed the meeting to proceed. She did not dramatize the answer. The facts did not need emphasis. Claudia shifted in the advisor's row, her bracelet catching the light with a brightness that now seemed vulgar. She looked toward Grant for reassurance, but he was no longer performing for her. He was counting losses too fast to disguise the panic beneath them. A woman who had mistaken access for permanence was watching a man discover the same lesson. Grant stood. His chair rolled back a few inches against the carpet, the sound soft but indecently noticeable. "This is my company," he said. The sentence was meant to command the room. It only exposed that the room had moved on. Serena looked at him then, not coldly, not cruelly, but with the measured distance of someone watching a contract enforce itself. It was entrusted to governance. The words entered the room without force and stayed there. Grant's mouth tightened because there was no easy defense against a truth that did not overreach. He could argue ownership. He could argue history. He could argue genius, sacrifice, risk, and the mythology of the founder alone in the storm. But he could not argue trust without reminding everyone why the trust had been written. Lydia activated the next procedural step. The wall screen asked for confirmation to proceed under adjusted voting authority. One by one, directors touched their tablets. Soft tones sounded around the table, each one polite, each one devastating. Grant turned toward the screen as the approvals accumulated without him. The system did not pause for his anger. It did not ask whether he felt betrayed. It did not care that his name was carved into the lobby downstairs. For years, he had believed governance existed to decorate his control with legitimacy. Now legitimacy was continuing without him. Claudia rose halfway, then sat down again when no one looked at her. Her borrowed confidence had nowhere to stand. Grant pressed his microphone again, but the indicator flashed amber, then went dark under meeting control protocol. He looked at Lydia. Lydia looked at the board record. Serena looked at neither of them for long. The vote opened without him. Grant's hand remained on the dead microphone. His reflection split across the polished table beside a nameplate that suddenly seemed like an artifact from a previous century. In that moment, the room did not remove him with anger. It simply continued. The first vote passed without Grant's number entering the count, and the room absorbed the result with the disciplined quiet of people trained never to look surprised by money moving. No one applauded, because applause would have made the correction feel personal, and personal things were exactly what the board now wished to avoid. The screen confirmed the adjusted authority, the trustees' temporary control, and the continuation of proceedings under independent governance rules. Grant had not been defeated by drama. He had been administratively removed from relevance. A director who had once asked Grant's permission before suggesting agenda changes now turned toward Serena and addressed her as the controlling voting representative for the next resolution. The authority moved through the room before anyone named it. Serena inclined her head once. "Continue." That was all she offered, and it was enough to make every person present understand where the center had shifted. The senior investor near the windows began speaking to Lydia about stabilizing the market announcement before noon, not to Grant, not through Grant, not with the nervous courtesy usually paid to a wounded founder. Another board member asked whether executive signing authority should be reviewed before any new acquisition documents left the building. A compliance officer at the side wall quietly sent a message through her encrypted phone, and within seconds 2 assistants outside the glass doors began redirecting scheduled briefings away from Grant's office. The company had already adjusted to its new authority. Grant watched these small movements with growing disbelief, because none of them were violent enough for him to condemn. They were polite. They were procedural. They were final. Claudia's humiliation arrived more slowly, like expensive perfume turning sour in a closed room. She had expected Serena to break, Grant to dominate, and the board to treat her presence as proof that his private life had already selected its next public companion. Instead, she sat in the advisor's row while powerful people carefully forgot she existed. No one asked for her opinion. No one offered her coffee. No one looked impressed by the bracelet on her wrist or the confidence she had borrowed from a man whose microphone no longer worked. She had come to witness a wife being reduced. She became the footnote. Grant finally stepped away from the head of the table, as if movement might restore proportion. "You are all making a mistake," he said, aiming the sentence at the board but bleeding it toward Serena. A younger director folded his hands and replied that the company needed continuity under enforceable governance. He used the exact language Grant had once praised in investor presentations. Hearing his own vocabulary used against him seemed to wound him more than open insult. Serena did not rescue him from it. She allowed the room to hold him accountable in the dialect he had taught it to speak. Lydia distributed the next resolution through the secure board system, and tablets lit up one by one with a soft glow across the polished table. The expensive coffee had gone untouched, forming dark rings inside white porcelain cups. The scent, once warm and commanding, now felt stale beneath the chilled air conditioning and the metallic hush of legal consequence. Grant looked toward the doors, perhaps expecting some loyal executive to enter, some old ally to interrupt, some force outside the record to remind everyone who he had been. No one came. A senior partner from the company's banking syndicate, present by secure video feed, requested that all pending credit confirmations be routed through Serena's approved authority until the review ended. Grant turned sharply toward the screen. "You know who built this relationship." The banker paused with professional sympathy. "We know who can bind the company today." That was the cleanest abandonment yet. Serena's eyes lowered for a moment, not in pity, but in recognition of the lesson arriving exactly where it belonged. Grant's world had never depended only on loyalty. It had depended on enforceable benefit, and now benefit had recalculated. Claudia stood at last, smoothing her skirt with fingers that trembled despite the diamonds. She whispered Grant's name, but he did not answer, and the silence between them revealed what their arrangement had always been: access without foundation. Serena heard it and remained still. No victory display. No jealous glance. No need. The board proceeded to limit Grant's interim authority, require dual approval for major transactions, and transfer emergency communications to Serena and the trustees. Each resolution passed with the soft tone of a tablet confirming consent. Each tone removed another layer of authority from Grant's life. By the time Lydia announced the final governance safeguard for the session, Grant was still standing, but the room had already learned to sit without him. By the time the last interim safeguard appeared on the wall screen, the boardroom had changed ownership of the silence. The same glass walls held the same Manhattan skyline. The same untouched coffee sat cooling beside encrypted phones, and the same polished table reflected the same people in softer, more cautious shapes. Yet no decision in the room now moved through Grant Hawthorne. He stood near the head of the table, one hand still resting close to the dead microphone, trying to gather command from objects that had stopped serving him. The nameplate in front of his chair still carried his title, but titles are fragile things when the system behind them refuses to answer. Lydia Fairmont closed the voting summary and placed both hands calmly over her legal pad. "The record confirms temporary suspension, transfer of voting administration, and continuation under independent oversight," she said. No one interrupted. No one dared make the moment smaller. Grant looked at the directors first, searching their faces for regret, fear, gratitude, anything he could turn into leverage. He found only professional distance. The oldest investor avoided his eyes with the efficiency of a man exiting a position before the market opened. The banker on the screen had already muted himself. Claudia stood beside the advisor's row with one hand near her throat, visibly uncertain whether she was still attached to power or merely standing too close to its collapse. Grant finally turned to Serena. His face had lost the polish of performance, leaving behind something harsher and more human. Disbelief that the woman he had placed beside him had been reading every door he thought only he could unlock. "How long?" he asked. The question came out lower than he intended. It was not an apology. It was not even understanding. It was the first sound of a man realizing the trap had not been built overnight. Serena looked at him with no triumph in her expression. That wounded him more than satisfaction would have, because satisfaction could be dismissed as revenge, and her calm looked too much like judgment already completed. She did not lean forward. She did not look toward Claudia. She did not explain the years of corrections he ignored, the meetings he kept her out of, the signatures he scattered across documents like a king tossing coins to servants. She gave him only the truth he had earned. Since you stopped reading. The sentence was quiet enough to force the room to hear it. Grant's eyes flickered, and for 1 second all his empire mythology stood naked. The genius founder, the fearless negotiator, the man who claimed to see 10 years ahead but could not see the consequence of his own signature. He wanted anger from her then. He wanted something loud enough to make her seem cruel, emotional, ungrateful, anything that would restore him as the reasonable man surrounded by betrayal. Serena refused him. Silence held the record steady. Grant stepped closer to the table. You let me walk into this. Serena's fingers rested beside the sealed notice, relaxed, elegant, unmoved. You filed it yourself. Lydia's gaze lowered to the record, confirming without needing to speak that every draft, every routed memo, every attempted restructuring had carried Grant's own authorization trail. The directors understood the precision of it. Serena had not hunted him. She had allowed his arrogance to complete the paperwork. Claudia whispered something, perhaps his name, perhaps a warning, but it dissolved before reaching the table. Grant did not turn toward her. The room no longer had space for borrowed intimacy. It had become a boardroom governed by procedure. Serena rose slowly, and the movement drew every eye not because she demanded attention, but because authority had already arrived before she stood. She smoothed nothing, gathered nothing, performed nothing. Her composure made every display of wealth in the room feel unnecessary. Grant looked at her as if seeing, too late, the difference between silence born from weakness and silence backed by completed filings. You tried to silence my shares, she said. The trust answered. Then she turned to Lydia. Finalize it. 2 words returned the room to motion. The trustees confirmed receipt, the governance record locked, and the wall screen shifted from dispute to execution. Grant remained standing as the vote he had designed to diminish her became the instrument that removed him. Serena did not watch him fall. She watched the company continue. The final confirmation arrived without ceremony, a quiet line of text appearing on the wall screen. Voting administration transferred. Emergency authority had been reassigned, and the company's next phase would proceed under Serena Blackwell's control and independent oversight. No one applauded. In rooms like that, applause was for charity luncheons and public milestones, not for the precise removal of a man who had mistaken habit for permanence. Grant remained near the head of the table, surrounded by the remains of his own confidence. His suit was still flawless, his cufflinks still expensive, his name still carved into the lobby downstairs, but none of those things could cast a vote. That was the loss his suit could not hide. Lydia Fairmont closed the governance record and signaled to the compliance officer beside the glass doors. A young associate stepped forward, careful and expressionless, and removed the chairman nameplate from Grant's place at the table. The sound was almost nothing. It still seemed to empty the room. Claudia watched it happen with parted lips, her face pale beneath the soft perfection of makeup designed for proximity to power, not its withdrawal. She looked at Grant as if waiting for him to reverse the moment through force of personality. But his personality had finally met a structure that required no permission from him. He turned to Serena with a last attempt at dignity, though anger had already cracked the edge of his voice. You think this makes you powerful? Serena stood with the calm of a woman who had never needed the room to misunderstand her in order to survive it. She looked once at the table, once at the screen, and finally at the man who had tried to turn marriage into a loophole. There was no hatred in her face. Hatred would have given him too much importance. No, she said softly. It proves you never were. The sentence landed cleaner than any accusation could have. Grant's expression hardened, then emptied, because there was no legal theory, no investor memory, no borrowed loyalty, and no mistress in cream silk that could answer it. Around him, directors began gathering tablets and documents, already speaking in low voices about transition schedules, disclosure timing, voting certifications, and the stabilization of executive authority. The company had not collapsed. It had simply stopped pretending he was its center. Serena turned from him without waiting for permission, and the room made way for her with the instinctive respect it had once reserved for him. Lydia walked half a step behind her, not as a servant, not as a savior, but as the keeper of a truth finally entered into record. At the doorway, Serena paused only long enough to receive the updated authority packet from the compliance officer. She did not look back at Claudia. She did not look back at Grant. Some departures are louder because no one is allowed to stop them. By evening, the chairman's office was dark except for the city light cutting across the floor in long silver lines. Grant sat alone behind a desk that still carried his title but no longer carried his authority. His encrypted phone rested beside him, unanswered. His coffee had gone cold. On the screen before him, the final board notice remained open, its language calm, sterile, and devastating. Serena's car moved through the private exit below, not toward exile, but toward the next meeting where the company would answer to lawful authority instead of ego. She had not stolen his company. She had made the record admit who could still bind it. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.